It wasn't a camping trip this time. I was out in Oregon, east of Green Peter Lake, deep into the Cascades, just out for a day of fishing. No big plan, no campsite, just me, my gear, and a narrow stream I'd spotted on an old topographic map the week before. It was the kind of place you don't end up by accident.
No signposts.
No trail markers. Just old logging roads turned to overgrown ruts and a whole lot of silence between the trees. I had to park my truck maybe 2 miles back because the road got too rough and too narrow. I didn't want to risk busting a tire on a rock and getting stranded, so I threw my pack on and hiked the rest of the way in. That morning had started cold, with some ground fog between the trees, and I remember the way the sun lit the mist from behind as I made my way down the slope toward the water. There weren't any real trails out there. It was mostly a matter of guessing direction, watching the slope, listening for moving water. Eventually, I heard the stream before I saw it. That fast-moving gurgle over rocks. It wasn't wide, maybe 4 feet across at most, but the water was clear and cold, and I could see brook trout nosing through the current near the bank. I picked a spot where a log had fallen partway across the stream and sat there for a minute to set up. No sound but the water and the occasional wind in the treetops.
No voices, no planes overhead.
Just that kind of remote stillness you only get way off the grid. I started fishing a short stretch, moving slowly upstream, taking my time. I don't know how long I'd been out there. Maybe an hour. Could have been more. I hadn't seen or heard another soul all morning. No fresh boot prints on the mud near the bank. No tire tracks on the way in. I figured I had the whole drainage to myself. Then I heard branches shift behind me. Just a soft rustling. Not big enough to be a bear or anything like that. More like someone walking. I turned, thinking maybe a deer had wandered close. But no, it was a woman.
Young.
Early 20s, maybe. She stepped right out of the trees like she'd been there the whole time. Dark green pants, beige shirt, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife patch on the shoulder. One of those Forest Service-style ball caps with a flat brim. Her hair was tied back. Didn't look panicked, just calm and focused. She didn't say anything at first, just gave me a nod and motioned toward my gear. She wanted to check my license. I handed it to her without much thought. It was legit, tucked into the clear pocket on the back of my fishing vest. She looked it over real thorough and then asked to see what I was using. I showed her my rod, the barbless hooks, the creel with 2 small brookies already inside. She just gave another nod and handed the license back. Then she stood there for a second, looking down the stream, like she was scanning something only she could see. It was strange. Not just that she was there, but how quietly she'd shown up. I'd been listening to the woods all morning. If she'd been walking anywhere nearby, I should have heard her. But there'd been nothing. Just silence, then rustling, then her. I asked her what she was doing way out there by herself, but she didn't say much. Just said she was checking on things. No smile, no small talk. Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come, into the trees. Didn't follow a trail.
Didn't say goodbye.
Just disappeared between the trunks like she was part of the forest. After she left, I stood there for a while. I listened. Thought maybe I'd hear another voice, someone further back in the woods. Maybe a partner watching her from a distance. Or a vehicle engine if they'd parked somewhere nearby. But there was nothing. Just the water and wind again. I walked upstream a bit, thinking maybe I'd see some sign of where she'd gone. But I didn't. No fresh footprints in the soft dirt.
No vent ferms.
It was like she hadn't passed through at all. I even checked the slope behind where she'd come from, but it was all loose pine needles and dry branches. Anything stepping there would have made noise. I don't know how she moved that quiet. I've been in the woods most of my life, and I still make noise getting through stuff like that. I kept fishing for a while, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way she just appeared, then vanished. How the hell did she even know I was out there? It's not like I checked in with anyone. There wasn't a station or a ranger office nearby. No trail cams. My truck was parked out of view, behind a rise and some thick alder. It wasn't visible from any road or path. The only way someone would know I was there was if they were already in the woods nearby, watching, or if they had seen me hiking in and followed. But I hadn't passed anyone. And that raised more questions. If she was official and with the department, where was her radio? Her GPS? Why didn't she check in or have a truck nearby? I never saw a vehicle. No other people. No campsite. Just her, then nothing. I hiked back out a few hours later after trying to shake the feeling. Every now and then I'd stop and look around. Scan the trees. Try to catch movement. It started to feel like someone was out there just outside of view. Not following me, not chasing, just there. That prickling feeling on the back of your neck. Like eyes. When I got back to my truck, I checked the area again. Nothing disturbed. No prints in the dust around the tires. No other vehicles. The road was still quiet. I drove back slow, watching the tree line the whole way. Never saw anyone. That night, back in town, I looked up the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife field staff. Thought maybe I could find a name or picture that matched her. But there wasn't much online. No field agents listed in that area. I called the regional office the next day, just out of curiosity. Asked if they had anyone patrolling that stretch near the stream. The woman on the phone said no, they don't regularly send people out there unless there's an issue reported. She asked if I wanted to file a complaint or report anything unusual. I just said no. Said it was nothing. Because honestly, I don't know what I'd even report. She didn't do anything wrong. Didn't say anything threatening.
Just checked my stuff and left.
But something about it didn't sit right. Not because of what happened, but because of how. How she got there. How she left. How she knew. The way I figure it, someone else had to be out there. Someone I never saw. Maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe she was part of something else, survey crew, researchers, hell, even military. Who knows? Could be someone was watching me the whole time, and she was the one they sent to make contact, just to feel me out.
See what I'd say. See what I'd do.
I don't fish that deep anymore. Not alone, anyway. Not in places where nobody should know you're there. Because sometimes it's not the wildlife you need to worry about. Sometimes it's the people who already know you're in the woods, before you even know you're being watched. When I was about 12, we went camping in this weird, dry part of Western Australia, Hamelin Pool, near the stromatolites. I remember the name because Dad kept going on about how old they were, billions of years or something. At that age, I didn't really care. All I knew was that we were going to be spending a few days in this remote place, just us, me, my parents, and my 2 younger brothers. We pulled into what was supposed to be a caravan park, but it wasn't what any of us expected. It was basically an old sports oval that someone had decided to turn into a campground. There were no trees, no real spots set up for camping, just a flat, open patch of dry, sun-baked dirt with a few patches of grass that looked more dead than alive. There was a single gazebo in the middle of the whole thing, one of those metal-roofed ones with a concrete slab and a couple of faded picnic benches underneath. No other cars, no other tents, no sign of life at all. The office building looked abandoned, even though there was a dusty sign hanging out front with faded letters that said Hamelin Camping and Caravan Ground. Dad said he'd already paid online, so we just set up near the edge of the oval, away from the gazebo, thinking maybe we'd get a bit of privacy, even though nobody else was around. The heat during the day was unbearable, the kind of dry heat that makes your skin feel like it's cracking open. We tried to keep the tent closed to avoid flies and dust, but it turned into an oven inside. There was no shade except for the gazebo, so we ended up sitting there most of the day, drinking warm water and swatting away bugs. My brothers, who were maybe 9 and 7, kept complaining they were bored, and honestly, I was too. The place just felt off from the beginning. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the stillness that made everything feel unnatural. Even the few trees we could see far off in the distance looked dry and dead. When night came, the air cooled quickly. We cooked up something simple, sausages and baked beans on the little camp stove, and then all crawled into the tent early because there wasn't much else to do. No signal, no light except the stars and our lantern, and no noise except the distant sound of insects. The sort of camping night where you expect to sleep soundly just because there's nothing else going on. I must have fallen asleep quickly because I don't remember lying there long. but something woke me up. Not a sound, not at first, more like a feeling. That kind of alertness you get when your body just knows something isn't right. I opened my eyes and saw the dim green glow of the lantern we had left on at the far side of the tent. I could see the outlines of my brothers beside me, curled up in their sleeping bags. Then I noticed my mom and dad sitting up, both very still. There was a sound outside. Very soft footsteps.
Fast.
But not heavy. Light, like someone barefoot or wearing socks. It circled the tent once, slowly, and then again a little quicker. I could see the shadow of someone through the nylon wall of the tent as they passed by the lantern's light. It wasn't a sharp silhouette, just the vaguest movement, like a shadow flicking by. The footsteps weren't loud enough to tell if it was one person or more.
Not weak snapping.
Just that faint sound, grit and dust under feet, moving around us in slow loops. Mom whispered something, barely audible. Then Dad slowly reached for the torch near the flap. But he didn't open it. He just sat there frozen, listening. I could tell by his face that he was trying to figure out what to do. He was usually calm about this kind of stuff. Logical. But even in the dim light, I could see his jaw was clenched. That scared me more than the footsteps. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again.
Faster.
A full lap around the tent. Then silence. Then again, faster, like whoever it was running around us. Still light, still soft, but fast enough that the fabric of the tent fluttered slightly with each pass. I wanted to say something, but couldn't move. My brothers were both awake now. Both sitting up, eyes wide, not saying a word. No one moved. No one even breathed loud. It was like all five of us were stuck in this frozen panic, just listening. Then it stopped completely. Not like it faded away, just stopped. Like whoever or whatever was doing it had just dropped to the ground or vanished. There were no more footsteps, no wind, no sound of someone walking away. Just dead silence. We all sat there for what felt like forever. Dad finally turned off the lantern. We didn't say anything. We just lay back down, all of us still in our clothes, and stared at the ceiling of a tent. I don't know how long I was awake after that. Could have been hours. But at some point, I must have drifted off again. We were all up as soon as the sun came up. No one really said anything. Dad just started packing everything up. Not even breakfast. Just rolling up the sleeping bags, tearing down the tent, tossing everything in the back of the car. Mom helped quietly. My brothers didn't complain. They just did what they were told, which wasn't like them at all. The mood was heavy. Everyone was tense and tired, like we'd all been through something we didn't understand. Before we left, I walked over to the gazebo while Dad was tying down the last of the gear.
I don't even know why.
Curiosity, I guess. There was a weird smell in the air, like rust and sweat. I walked up to one of the benches and saw a plastic bottle lying on its side. It had some kind of murky liquid inside, and no label. Nearby, there were 2 cigarette butts on the concrete, fresh enough that they hadn't been blown away or covered in dust like everything else. And a single, narrow footprint in the dry dirt near the edge of the slab.
Noż cóż.
Just the imprint of toes and a heel. Barefoot. I walked back to the car without saying anything. Dad looked at me and nodded. We drove out of there without looking back. Didn't even stop at the stromatolites. I think we were all just done. I've been camping a lot since then. All over Australia. In forests, deserts, beaches. Most places feel fine. Even remote bushland with no reception and no one around doesn't bother me. But that place, whatever it was about it, felt wrong from the start. It didn't feel like somewhere people were supposed to stay. And to this day, I don't know who or what was running around our tent that night. But I know what I heard, and I know I never want to go back. We got to the state park a little before sunset. It was early fall, one of those cool days where the sun feels warm, but the shade reminds you that summer's over. The air smelled like dried leaves and dirt, and the trees were already turning yellow and orange. I was with my girlfriend at the time, Jen, and my roommate, Mark. The 3 of us had been camping a bunch of times before, so we didn't think much of doing a spontaneous overnight trip. We just packed some sloppy Joe mix, a couple of sleeping bags, and a tent, and drove the hour or so out from the city. We were setting up the tent when a big black dog came bursting out of the treeline, moving fast and low like it was chasing something. At first I froze, thinking it was a coyote or a stray, but when it got closer we saw the collar and tags. Its tongue was hanging out, and it seemed friendly enough, just overexcited. We managed to calm it down and walked it over to the next campsite, about 30 yards down the dirt path from ours. There was a couple there, probably late 20s or early 30s, and they thanked us when we returned the dog. They didn't seem weird, just your average weekend campers. The guy was tall and wore a Carhartt hoodie, and the woman had a big knit beanie and one of those enamel mugs in her hand. They said they hadn't realized the dog had run off. We chatted for a second, then went back to our site to finish setting up.
I didn't really think about them again after that.
By the time the fire was going and the sloppy joes were bubbling in a pot, the sun was down and the sky had gone black. The campground wasn't completely full, but there were a few other tents scattered off in the distance. The woods around us were quiet except for the occasional owl or a squirrel. Jen was stirring the pot while Mark and I sat on logs, talking about nothing important. Then I noticed a light flashing at us. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a steady flick on, flick off, flick on again. At first, I thought maybe someone was signaling their dog or messing around with a flashlight. I watched for a few seconds, then nudged Jen and said, "They're flashing a light over here." She didn't even look, just said, "Ignore it, probably nothing." But they kept doing it. Every few seconds, a quick flash, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer. I started to feel irritated more than anything. It had been going on for 15 minutes now, long enough to seem intentional. Mark noticed it too, but shrugged it off. We finally finished eating, packed the food away, and dumped water on the fire until it was just glowing coals. That's when I heard them coming down the path. Crunching leaves, footsteps in the gravel, voices talking, too loud for how late it was. I checked my watch. It was 12:34. Quiet hours at the park start at 10. They were walking slowly, both with headlamps on, moving in sync like they were in a parade. But what really caught me was the way the woman was talking. Not a normal conversation, she was narrating something like reading a script or writing out loud. "Dear Diary," I heard her say clearly. My stomach dropped a little. I remember that exact moment, because Jen had frozen with the pot lid still in her hand, and Mark had stood up slightly like he wasn't sure if he should greet them or not. They kept walking until they were about 15 yards away from us. Then they just stopped. Didn't say anything. Just stood there, staring. The headlamps made it hard to see their faces, but the beams were pointed near us. I looked at Mark. He looked at me. It felt like 5 minutes passed, though I know it wasn't more than 10 seconds. Mark finally called out, "Hello?" They didn't move for a second. Then the woman said in this strange, flat tone, "It seems they've extinguished their fire." We hadn't. The coals were still glowing orange behind us. Then they turned and walked back to their campsite. Not a word more. I couldn't shake the way she said that. It sounded wrong, like she was reading lines from a play or like she was saying it for someone else, someone who wasn't there. Jen tried to brush it off and kept saying they were just weird or high or something. Mark didn't say much at all, just kept staring down the path toward their site. We got ready for bed, not long after. It was cold enough that you could see your breath. We crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bags, and I turned off the lantern. The tent had mesh sides, and from where I was lying, I could see out toward the other site if I looked sideways. I remember turning to face that way, just casually glancing out as my eyes adjusted to the dark. That's when I saw them again. They were crawling, on all fours, both of them, slowly, through the leaves and dirt, heading toward our tent. Their headlamps were off now, and they moved almost silently, like they were trying not to break twigs. My mind went blank. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. They crawled forward, side by side, moving in short bursts like animals stalking something. I whispered Jen's name, but I didn't want to make any noise.
She didn't respond.
I looked at Mark in the dark, and his eyes were wide open. Then, without any warning or sound, they stopped, stayed still for a few seconds, then turned around and crawled away, back toward their campsite. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I just laid there, waiting for sounds, waiting for the zipper to move, for footsteps, for anything. But nothing else happened. The night was quiet after that. Too quiet, honestly. In the morning, we packed up fast. None of us wanted to stay longer than we had to. The couple walked by us around 8 a.m., fully packed, dog trotting along on a leash. The guy gave a nod and said, "Morning." The woman smiled like nothing had happened, like they hadn't stood staring at us, hadn't crawled toward our tent in the middle of the night. I couldn't even think of a way to respond. Just stared at them as they disappeared down the road. We didn't report it. What would we say? That a couple was acting weird? Crawling around at night isn't a crime. And honestly, I didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to leave. We didn't camp again for a long time after that. Mark never talks about it. If I bring it up, he just shrugs like it didn't matter. Jen and I broke up about 6 months later, not because of that night, but I've wondered if maybe it stuck with her the same way it did with me. Even now, years later, every time I go camping, if I go, I find myself staring off into the woods once it gets dark, wondering if someone's out there, low to the ground, watching, waiting, pretending to be something they're not. My wife and I were backpacking near Mt. Hood in Oregon. It was early fall, and the days were still warm, but the nights had started getting colder. We'd picked a quiet spot off one of the lesser-used trails, pitched our tent on a flat patch of ground tucked between some thick trees and a small stream. It was one of those rare trips where everything went according to plan, smooth hike in, good weather, and just enough signal earlier in the day to text our families that we were off-grid for a couple of nights. We made dinner over the stove, sat around for a bit watching the light fade through the trees, and then crawled into our sleeping bags just after dark. No campfire, no noise, just the sound of the stream and the wind moving through the evergreens. I should have been able to sleep. I was tired enough, and it was calm and quiet outside. But something felt off in my body. My lower back had this weird, dull ache that wouldn't go away no matter how I shifted around. I figured I'd pulled something during the hike, maybe from the pack or from lifting a rock when we were clearing the tent spot. But the pain kept building. It wasn't sharp exactly, more like a growing pressure, radiating from my left side down into my groin. I knew this feeling. I'd had it once before years ago, and I couldn't believe it was happening again, especially not now. I tossed and turned in my bag, trying to stretch, curl up, flatten out, anything. By midnight, the pain was wrapping around my side like a vice. I was sweating inside my sleeping bag, even though the air outside was in the low 40s. I sat up, breathing through my teeth, trying not to wake my wife. She was asleep next to me, her hood drawn tight, soft breath steady. I didn't want to panic her, but I knew what was happening. It was a kidney stone. I was in for a rough night. Eventually, I couldn't stay still anymore. Lying down made it worse, and every few minutes I'd get this rolling wave of nausea and heat that left me shaky. Around 3 a.m., I realized I wasn't going to make it through the night inside the tent. I needed to move, to walk it off the best I could. On top of that, my stomach had started churning, and not in a mild way. I really needed to take a crap. Bad. I waited a bit, trying to decide if I could hold off until morning, but the pressure was building too fast. It felt like everything in my body was falling apart at once. I reached for my headlamp, careful not to make too much noise, unzipped the tent slowly, and pulled on my boots. The cold air hit me hard as I crouched in the doorway, my breath coming out in small puffs. I turned on the headlamp and aimed it out into the woods. That's when I saw them. Dozens of glowing eyes. Low to the ground, motionless. I froze. The light bounced a bit with my heartbeat, and the eyes flickered. Some of them blinked. I couldn't see shapes clearly, just eyes reflecting back at me from the blackness. My first thought was deer, maybe elk, but there were so many. And they were quiet, completely still and silent.
No footsteps, no rustling.
Just eyes. Watching. A chill ran through me, and for a second I honestly thought I was going to piss myself. My brain was running wild, throwing out images of bears, cougars, wolves. Oregon isn't exactly free of predators, and we were far enough off trail that help would be hours away if something went wrong. I didn't have any kind of weapon with me, just a dull camping knife in my bag and a whistle somewhere buried in my coat pocket. I stood there, half crouched in the tent doorway, breathing hard, heart pounding so loud it was all I could hear. My stomach was cramping, my back felt like someone was stabbing me with a hot rod, and now I was possibly facing down a pack of wild animals. My body was in full revolt. Then one of the sets of eyes moved, just a few steps forward into the beam of my headlamp. Long, thin legs, large ears, a small head. It was a deer, just a deer. And then another moved and another, and slowly the shapes became clearer. They were all deer, maybe a dozen or more, standing in the trees and brush near our campsite. Not running, not afraid, just standing there watching. I let out a shaky breath and almost laughed. I wasn't going to die out here, not tonight. Not from an animal attack, at least. Still, it didn't make it any easier. The pain in my side had doubled while I stood frozen. My stomach was about to explode. I took a few steps away from the tent, past the edge of our camp, and found a spot behind a tree. I won't go into detail, but it wasn't dignified. The headlamp stayed on, but I avoided looking into the woods again. I could still feel those eyes. The next few hours were some of the worst of my life. I couldn't lay down for more than a minute without the pain getting worse. I paced around the camp in circles, sometimes holding my side, sometimes leaning against trees, trying not to throw up. The deer eventually wandered off, but I barely noticed. My whole world had shrunk down to the sharp, twisting pain in my gut and the sick feeling crawling up my throat. Around sunrise, I finally sat down on a rock and just stared at the sky as it turned gray, then pink, then gold. My wife stirred not long after, and I told her what is going on. She didn't say much, just started packing. I couldn't eat. I barely had the strength to help break down the tent, but I forced myself to do what I could. Every movement felt like a punch in the side. I had a couple of prescription painkillers in my first aid kit, left over from an old dental surgery. I took one, chewed it just to get it in my system faster, and waited. When it kicked in, I felt lightheaded and floaty, but it dulled the edge enough to move. We split the gear differently for the hike out. She took more of the load, and I just carried what I could manage. The pack still felt like it weighed 100 pounds. We hiked for 4 hours. Every step felt like it took everything I had. The pain would spike out of nowhere and make me double over. Other times, I'd get cold sweats and have to stop and lean on a tree while the world tilted around me. The trail wasn't hard, mostly downhill, but it felt endless. I remember stumbling once and almost going over the edge of a slope, catching myself at the last second. My legs were shaky. I was soaked in sweat, but I kept moving. We finally made it back to the car in the early afternoon. I collapsed into the passenger seat, rolled the window down, and just breathed. My wife drove, one hand tight on the wheel, the other occasionally resting on my knee. We didn't talk much. I think she could tell I was barely holding it together. We made it to a hospital a couple hours later. The ER confirmed what I already knew: kidney stone. Not a big one, but enough to cause all that pain. They gave me fluids, more meds, and told me to rest and wait for it to pass. It did, eventually. A few days later, at home. Thankfully, it wasn't a moment I'll ever forget. The whole thing stuck with me. Not just the pain, but how quickly everything changed. One minute I was sleeping under the stars. The next I was pacing in the dark, convinced I was going to die with my pants down, staring at glowing eyes in the woods. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or serial killers. It was just my own body, failing me at the worst possible time. And a bunch of deer. Still, I don't think I'll ever forget the way those eyes looked in the beam of my headlamp, or how helpless I felt in that moment, knowing there was no easy way out. Just pain, distance, and the long way back. We were somewhere along the Snake River side of Hell's Canyon, hiking a narrow, dusty trail that cut along a steep incline. I don't even remember what time it was, probably close to mid-morning. The air was already heating up, dry and still, and the sun was harsh against the rock faces around us. I had my pack on, not too heavy, and my dog trotted along at my heels. My wife was maybe 20 feet ahead of me, leading the way. We were only a couple miles from our camp, just out for a short hike before breakfast. The dog wore a little orange vest, partly for visibility and partly because he was the kind of dog that liked to barrel through brush without looking, and it helped protect his sides. He was small, a mixed terrier, mostly hair and attitude. He darted between us, sometimes running up ahead to sniff something, then falling back beside me again. We'd crossed a small wash earlier, and the terrain had turned scrubby, low dry grasses and thorny bushes everywhere. Rattlesnake territory. I kept my eyes down, checking every few feet, and had already seen a couple lizards darting across the trail. It felt normal for a place like this. Wild, but manageable. Then I saw something moving on my stomach. I stopped walking. I thought it was a mosquito or maybe a burr clinging to my shirt. I pulled the hem of my shirt up and saw it. A tick, dark brown, legs moving slowly as it tried to dig through the fabric to my skin. I flicked it off, kind of irritated but not too concerned. I'd had ticks on me before. 1 or 2 wasn't a big deal. But then I looked down at the dog. His vest, that bright orange fabric, was covered in tiny black spots. At first, I thought it was dirt or burrs, but when I leaned down and looked closer, I saw the spots were moving. They were ticks, at least a dozen that I could count without even lifting him up, clinging to the seams of his vest and crawling into his fur. Something about that moment flipped a switch in my head. A sudden wave of alarm swept over me, like I'd stepped into something we weren't prepared for. I straightened up and looked down the trail toward my wife. She had stopped walking. She was staring down at her own jeans. I saw her take a step back, then another, and start brushing herself off. From where I was standing, I couldn't make out the details right away, but then she turned slightly toward me, and I saw the horror of it. Her jeans were covered, absolutely crawling with ticks. They clung in layers, especially around the seams. The fabric over her crotch and the tops of her thighs was so thick with them that it looked black. They were moving, burrowing, fighting to get through. I'd never seen anything like it, not even close. It looked like something out of a nightmare. And they weren't just on the front. Her legs, waist, even her boots had clusters of them. Like the entire hillside had erupted with ticks, and they'd picked her as their target. She kept calm, at least from the outside. I could see the quickness in her movements, though, like she was trying not to panic. She was brushing them off, one hand after another, as fast as she could, but there were too many. Every time she knocked some away, more surfaced from folds or creases. She turned and started running back the way we'd come. I followed immediately, trying to check myself as I moved. I saw another one crawling up my sock. I stopped just long enough to rip the sock halfway down and crush the tick with a rock. The dog ran ahead, oblivious to what was happening to him. He was too used to hiking and too used to the vest. It wasn't slowing him down, but I could see more of the ticks clinging to him now, moving down into the hair on his neck. The trail back to camp wasn't long, but it felt endless. I started to feel the crawling everywhere. My scalp, behind my ears, down my back, even though I hadn't seen anything there yet. It was like my body knew it was under attack, even before my eyes confirmed it. We passed the spot where we'd seen the snake earlier. It was coiled at the edge of the trail, in the shade of a big sagebrush. The dog had walked right across it earlier without noticing, and I just about had a heart attack. I'd ended up killing it with a rock and a tent stake I had in my pack. Not something I liked doing, but I didn't want it to nail my dog the third time around. It was still lying there now, curled and stiff, mouth partly open. I didn't even glance at it on the way back. When we got to camp, my wife was already stripping her clothes off right next to the tent. We were set up in a small, cleared space surrounded by scrub brush and a few stunted trees. There were other campers nearby, close enough to see but not right next to us. Still, she didn't care. Shirt, jeans, socks, everything came off and went straight into a garbage bag we kept in the truck for dirty gear. I started doing the same. My shirt came off, then my boots, then the socks. Ticks were falling off me like grains of dirt. I counted over 20 on my pants alone. Most were crawling, but I found at least 3 already dug in, their heads buried in the skin of my shin and thigh. I pulled them out with tweezers from our first aid kit, hands shaking. Blood ran down my leg in thin lines, but I didn't stop. We checked each other as best we could. No part of either of us was spared. The waistband areas were the worst, where the fabric was tight and sweat-soaked. That must have drawn them. I found one right below my belt line, deep in. She had several near the backs of her knees. We used duct tape to pull them off where we could and alcohol swabs where they'd bit in. The dog was the worst of all. I had to hold him down while she used tweezers and tape to pull over 30 ticks off him. Some were already attached around his ears and under his front legs. He whined and squirmed, confused, but we couldn't stop. I cut off the vest entirely and threw it in the trash bag with our clothes. We didn't even wait to recover. We threw our gear together in a rush, tent half collapsed, stove still warm. Shoved everything into the truck, garbage bag included. Didn't even take time to pack it properly. I just wanted out of there. Something about the sheer number of ticks, the way they'd found us all at once, felt wrong. Not like a few here and there. This was like stepping into a nest, like the whole place was alive with them. We drove out in silence for a while, down the long gravel road that wound out of the canyon. Dust blew up behind us in a thick cloud, catching the sunlight. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see more of them on my shoulders or the headrest. I scratched at phantom itches every few minutes. We stopped at a gas station a couple towns over. Used their restroom to recheck everything, our skin, our hair, inside our clothes. We found a few stragglers, but not many. I tossed the garbage bag into a dumpster behind the building. Didn't even want to risk taking it home. We ended up staying at a cheap motel that night, just to recover. Air conditioning, running water, a hot shower. None of it had ever felt that good before. We washed everything twice. Scrubbed ourselves raw. The dog finally slept, curled up in a towel between us. We never went back to that part of the canyon. I've done a lot of hiking, seen a lot of wild places, but that was something else. I still think about it sometimes. How fast it went from a peaceful trail to a nightmare. How we nearly didn't notice until it was too late. I always check for ticks now. First thing I do when I step off a trail, before I even sit down. I check the dog too. Every inch of him. I don't care if it takes an hour. Because once you've seen that many, felt them crawling across your skin, biting their way in, you never forget. My wife and I had decided to take a short camping trip in the cliffy wilderness area of Red River Gorge. It was early spring, though the nights still felt like winter, cold, damp, and quiet in a way only deep woods can be. We both had a few days off work, and we figured we'd go midweek to avoid any crowds. The trails were mostly empty, and we passed only a few hikers on the way in. It felt remote in a good way, isolated, but peaceful. We hiked in about 4 or 5 miles, taking our time, stopping to look at frozen creeks and rock formations still slick with moisture from snowmelt. There were patches of snow tucked in the shadows under pine branches and between the rocks. The ground was soft in places, soaked and squishy from the thaw. We found a flat spot off one of the side trails, not far from a small stream that was flowing steadily from all the runoff. There weren't any official campsites there, but it was clearly used by backpackers. There was a fire ring, and the undergrowth was trampled down. We pitched our tent under a stand of trees, got a small fire going, made dinner, and settled in for the night. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not dead quiet. There were owls and the occasional rustle in the leaves, but no cars, no people, nothing man-made. It was just us out there in the dark woods. We climbed into our sleeping bags around 10 or so. It had dropped colder than I expected, and I curled up tighter in the bag, feeling the cold through the pad beneath me. My wife was already snoring softly next to me. I lay awake for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches above us. There was a kind of peace in it, like the wilderness was holding its breath. I must have finally fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was pitch black, and I was confused for a second. Then I heard it, this deep, solid thunk from somewhere off to the right. It was sharp and loud, like something heavy hitting a tree trunk. then another.
Thunk, thunk.
Followed by a crackle of branches and leaves as something tumbled down through the limbs. At first, I thought maybe a tree branch had broken off. But then I heard it again, another hard thud. This wasn't random. It was repeated, deliberate. These were rocks, big ones, being thrown up into the trees. And not close to the ground either. They were hitting the trunks way above head level. You could hear the impact. They weren't small stones. They had weight. I sat up and listened, heart suddenly pounding. Another one flew through the air. Thunk. This time, closer. It hit a trunk maybe 20 or 30 feet from us. Then I heard the bounce of it as it came down, crashing through branches, before landing somewhere in the brush with a thud and a roll. My wife woke up. She's the kind of person who gets angry when she's disturbed in her sleep, not scared. But even she sat up with a sharpness in her voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. We both unzipped the tent and stuck our heads out. It was too dark to see anything. Just black trees all around, our little clearing barely lit by the sliver of moon behind clouds. But the sounds didn't stop. Another rock flew in. You could hear the wind of it as it passed through the air before it smacked against another tree. I could almost feel the vibration of the impact. There was no laughter, no footsteps, no sign of anyone moving around. Just silence between the throws. We shouted out into the woods a few times, telling them to knock it off, yelling that it wasn't funny. I cursed louder than I usually would, thinking maybe that would scare them off. But nothing changed. The rocks kept coming. Not constant, but every minute or so, just enough to make us stay alert, to keep our nerves from settling. That's when I really started thinking about how remote we were. We hadn't seen another person on the trail for hours before we made camp. It was midweek. Cold. Late season. This wasn't a place people casually wandered into. And whoever it was, they weren't trying to be friendly. There was something messed up about the way they were doing it. Not trying to hit us. Just showing that they could. Showing how big the rocks were. How hard they could throw. It was like they wanted to scare us. After half an hour of this, we decided to pack up.
There was no sleeping after that.
We didn't even discuss it. My wife just started stuffing the sleeping bags into their sacks, and I followed suit. We packed with speed, but tried to stay quiet. Every time we zipped something, it felt loud. The rocks had stopped for a bit, but we weren't counting on it staying that way. We got our headlamps on, loaded our packs, and killed the fire. Then we left.
Just like that.
Middle of the night, out into the forest, guided only by the beams of our lamps. The trail was damp and uneven, tree roots and small rocks poking out from the soil, but we took our time. Every so often I'd stop and listen behind us. Nothing. Just our own breathing and the occasional creak of the woods. It took us a while to get back to the lot. A couple of hours, at least. The trail looped and dipped, and we had to navigate around mud holes and cross 2 shallow creeks. Our boots were soaked by the time we made it to the gravel path that led up to the lot. The first glimpse of our car's reflection in the distance gave me a huge wave of relief. But then my wife stopped walking. She was about 10 steps ahead of me, shining her light toward the parking lot. I came up beside her and followed her gaze. I was expecting to see other cars, maybe even a group that had pulled some stupid prank and beaten us back here somehow. But there was nothing, just our car. We stood there for a long second, just staring. The lot could hold at least 20 vehicles, but it was completely empty except for ours. Not even tire tracks in the gravel that looked fresh. No trash, no beer cans, no sign that anyone had pulled in or out that day. Just the wind and the sound of trees creaking far off in the distance. Something about that moment made everything feel worse. The forest had felt big and dark and wild before, but now it felt like something else. Like something had watched us out there. Not something magical or paranormal, just someone. A person who had no reason to be there. A person who didn't drive. A person who didn't leave any sign. A person who could throw rocks bigger than my head into trees 10 feet off the ground. We didn't talk. We just got in the car, turned the heat on, and drove. The roads were dark and winding, but I didn't care. I just wanted distance between us and the woods. We didn't even stop until we hit the highway. We got a motel near the next town over. Inside the room, It finally hit me how shaken I was. My hands were still trembling when I tried to plug in my phone. My wife lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, still in her jacket. We never reported it. What would we even say? Some asshole in the woods threw rocks at us? There wasn't a crime to report, just a feeling that something had gone too far. A line had been crossed. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Whoever it was had waited until 2 a.m. They didn't come close. They didn't talk. They didn't have a car. I've been camping dozens of times since then, but I never go back to Clifty, not even to drive through. We only told a couple of close friends about it. Every time I try to explain, it never sounds as bad as it felt in the moment. But I'll never forget that sound. The weight of a rock slamming into bark, high up in the dark trees, with nothing around for miles. I used to work at a Girl Scout camp tucked up against a national park. It wasn't one of those well-developed camps with paved roads and solid cabins. It was rustic. We had platform tents, a couple of rickety old cabins, and dirt roads that turned to mud after even a short rain. The boundary between our property and the national park was just a chain-link fence that ran along a small creek and disappeared into a thick patch of woods. Technically, it was supposed to mark the edge of camp, but in reality, it was so overgrown and broken in places that it was more of a suggestion than a boundary. The terrain back there was rough. There were steep drops into a ravine, big limestone rocks jutting out from the hills, and a few shallow caves along the creek. We always told the younger staff not to go too far out there, but the truth is we all did. There wasn't really a clear division between camp and park. It was easy to wander over without even realizing it. You'd be following the creek, and before you knew it, the trail markers disappeared and the trees got darker and thicker. Sometimes hikers came up the other way, lost or just taking a wrong turn, ending up right in our main camp area. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it always put everyone on edge. Just outside our gates, a little down the road, there was a place everyone called Helltown. It wasn't an official name, but that's what we all called it. Years ago, the government had forced out the families who lived there so they could expand the park. But instead of tearing down the buildings, they just left them. You could drive down the road and see these abandoned houses with sagging roofs and broken windows, old street signs rusted and leaning over. Nature had started to reclaim it, grass growing through the roads, vines up the walls, but it was still clearly a town. The place had a heavy, dead feeling to it. Nobody ever talked about going there, but we all knew it was too close for comfort. One summer night, I was walking through main camp with 2 other staff members. We were just doing rounds before bed. It was close to midnight. The entire place was quiet. No campers, just the few of us admin types left for the weekend to tidy up and prep for the next group. Main camp was lit by a single tall street light, one of those orange sodium lights that hums faintly and never really lights up the area properly, just casts long shadows. That's when we saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the light. He wasn't moving. Just standing there, head turned slightly, like he was listening. I remember freezing in place, not really understanding what I was looking at. It didn't register right away. No men were employed at our camp, not for that session. And no male visitors were allowed without strict check-in procedures. There was no way a man should be standing in the middle of our camp like that. The second we moved, he turned, saw us, and bolted. He ran into the woods behind the dining hall, towards that broken section of fence and the ravine beyond it. We ran to the office to report it, but our director brushed it off. Said it was probably just a hiker who got lost. But there was no way that was just a lost hiker. Lost hikers don't stand still in the middle of a silent camp at midnight. And they definitely don't take off running into the woods without saying a word when someone spots them. That moment stuck with me for weeks, but I tried to write it off. Tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a lost hiker who got spooked. Maybe someone from town thought it'd be funny to sneak in and scare us. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I knew for sure something was wrong. There was a weekend where only 3 of us were left at camp. Admin crew. Everyone else was off until Sunday evening. That Saturday night we decided to do a late Walmart run, just to grab some snacks and drinks. By the time we drove back, it was just after 3 a.m. The front gate to the camp was shut. That wasn't unusual. We locked it at night, even when only staff were staying. What was unusual was that it was locked from the inside. The padlock had been clicked shut on our side, and none of us had done it. I offered to hop the gate. I'd done it before. It wasn't tall, just annoying to climb in the dark. My legs were already sore from hiking earlier that day. I made it over, feet hitting the gravel hard, and started up the path with just my phone flashlight guiding the way. The camp was completely dark, no security lights on at that part of the property. Just trees pressing in close on both sides of the path, and the sound of gravel crunching under my feet. As I reached the bend in the path where the mailbox was, the spot where the opener button was mounted to a post, I saw movement ahead of me. It was subtle at first, just the sense that someone was walking. I thought maybe one of the other two had circled around through the woods or had gotten inside somehow. I called out quietly, just a name. No response. I called out again. The figure ahead of me stopped. I could see now it was a man. Taller than me, thin. Standing still, slightly hunched.
He didn't say anything.
He didn't wave or move toward me. He just stood there until I took one step closer. Then he turned and sprinted off the gravel path into the woods, disappearing completely. I froze. I don't even remember dropping my flashlight, but I must have because the light was suddenly spinning in the dirt. I turned and ran. I didn't even try to open the gate. I shoved myself through the narrow space between it and the post, tearing the back of my shirt and scraping at my side. I was bleeding by the time I got back in the car. One of the others drove us straight to the nearest town with cell service, and we called the cops from a gas station parking lot. They came out later that morning, around sunrise, took statements, walked the path, said they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. They told us it was probably a transient or just someone out for a walk who didn't want to be seen. But it didn't feel like that. Both of those nights, the man under the streetlight and the one I saw on the path, felt deliberate. Like we weren't just stumbling across someone. We were being watched. Or studied. It's hard to explain, but when you work at a camp like that, in a place so isolated, you get used to certain patterns. Sounds, rhythms. You know when something's out of place. And both those nights, something felt wrong. I didn't go back the next year. I told myself it was because I wanted a different job. But the truth is, I just couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that was, they weren't done. Then, the year after I quit, I heard about the Girl Scout camp murders on the news. Different camp, different state, but still, same setup. Remote location, kids, tents in the woods. When I heard the details, I just sat there frozen, feeling sick. I kept thinking about the man in the woods. The way he stood so still under the streetlight. The way he ran when I saw him too close. I'll never know who he was. Maybe it was just a drifter. Maybe someone looking for an easy target. But those nights changed the way I see isolated places. Changed the way I trust the quiet. The silence out there isn't always empty. Sometimes, someone's watching from just beyond the light. We've been backpacking for 3 days through Rocky Mountain National Park, somewhere outside of Estes Park, just me and two of my oldest friends from college. The kind of trip where we didn't set alarms, didn't bring much tech, and barely had service to check in with anyone back home. It was midsummer, mid-July, I think, and the air up there was thick with mosquitoes, especially the last day. The first 2 nights had been easy. Wide trails, crisp weather, amazing views. Elk grazing near camp, marmots screaming from the rocks, the kind of thing you come out here hoping to see. We had a map, loosely followed it, and picked a more remote site for our third and final night. The path followed a narrow river upstream, winding past a few established campsites. We saw a group of 2 setting up their gear a couple miles in. After them, the trail just kept climbing, brush getting denser, and the noise of the river louder. Our site sat right where the marsh started to spill into the riverbanks, tucked against a small stand of trees. The water widened into a slow, green-brown curve, insects dancing over it in swarms, with lily pads forming quiet eddies at the bends. The mosquitoes were brutal, so we threw on long sleeves and head nets. We set up camp early, pitched our tents, filtered some water, made lunch, and then packed light to head farther up the trail. None of us were ready to just sit around in the tent, swatting bugs and waiting for night. We figured the deeper we went into the backcountry, the better the wildlife sightings. That's when things started to feel strange. The trail kept going uphill, narrowing and roughening until it spit us into an area that looked like it had burned not long ago. A wildfire, probably from the previous year. The trees were black and skeletal, all twisted into each other, their bark cracked and falling off in big curled chunks. The ground was soft with ash in some spots, crusted with dried mud in others. Still, despite the damage, the place was full of life. We saw a pair of mule deer bolt up a ridge as we approached. Birds flitted through the branches. Something howled or yipped across the river. Couldn't tell if it was a fox or coyote. Then, about an hour in, we saw a moose. It stood on the far bank of the river, half hidden in smoke-colored willows. At first, we thought it might be dead, the way it stood so still. Its ribs jutted out like broken rungs of a ladder. Its fur hung in patches, thick and greasy. When it turned its head, one eye looked pale and sunken, almost like it was blind on that side. The thing stared at us for a long time, completely still, like it was sizing us up. None of us spoke. When it finally moved, it did so slowly, stiff-legged, and lumbered into the trees like it had all the time in the world. I'll never forget how quiet everything felt after that. We didn't say much walking back. That whole stretch of trail, through those burned trees and silent woods, felt off. Not haunted or cursed or anything like that, just wrong. Like nature was rebuilding itself, but in a way that didn't want us there. By the time we got back to camp, dusk was already crawling in. We made a small fire, boiled some food, then packed it all away properly and tied the bear bag high in a tree about 30 yards off. Even with bug spray and layers, we kept slapping at our necks and arms. I crawled into my tent early, still thinking about the moose, still a little on edge. That night I put my knife under my pillow, which I almost never do. Not because I expected anything, just, I don't know. Something about the day stuck with me. I woke up maybe around 2 or 3 a.m. It was cold, colder than it had been the last 2 nights, and I could hear something moving just outside. Snuffling, sniffing, wet breathing. Then a thud, then another. I held my breath, straining my ears, heart thumping hard. Then I heard one of my friends, barely above a whisper. Bear, bear, bear. I didn't even think. I grabbed the knife and unzipped the tent so fast the whole thing shook. I rolled out into the cold dirt in my underwear, knife in hand, and started yelling. Not words, not anything smart, just a deep, guttural, Gaia.
Go.
Get. My voice cracked. I stomped toward it like some half-crazed idiot. The bear, smallish, probably a young black bear, looked up, startled. Then it turned and just trotted off into the trees, back the way we'd come, toward the other campsites. I stood there panting, skin crawling, knife still raised. Then I remembered the family we saw earlier, the ones with the 2 small kids, setting up a few hours before us. My stomach dropped. I didn't think, didn't even throw pants on. I just bolted after the bear. I must have looked insane. Barefoot, running down a dirt trail in boxer briefs, brandishing a 10-inch fixed blade camping knife and shouting. I didn't even see the bear anymore. I was running on panic, pure and stupid. I came barreling into their camp, yelling, trying to explain about the bear. I think I said, "Bear's coming this way," or something like that, but it was dark and I was shaking and I probably looked like some crazed hill person out of a horror movie. The dad shot up, blinking, shirtless and barefoot, and just stood there frozen, like every warning he'd ever read was happening at once. The mom grabbed both kids and started dragging them down the trail in her sleeping clothes, moving fast and not looking back. I chased after her again with the knife, trying to say, "Wait." No, I'm not trying to, but I quickly realized I was making things worse. Eventually, I stopped. Stood there in the middle of the trail, chest heaving, freezing, starting to feel like the world's biggest idiot. I called back to my friends and told them what happened. I don't even know how long it took to settle everything. I ended up walking the family back to their site, after putting on clothes and ditching the knife. I tried explaining again. Told them about the bear. Told them I'd just panicked. Told them I wasn't a threat. They were polite enough, but I could tell. They weren't afraid of the bear anymore. They were afraid of me. The dad stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with a headlamp on and a hatchet in his lap. I went back to our camp, tail between my legs. My friends didn't stop laughing the whole next day. Knife guy, they started calling me. Crazy underwear survivalist. I deserved it. We hiked out the next morning in silence for a while, until someone said, at least the bear didn't maul anyone. That got a few tired chuckles.
I didn't see the family again.
Their car was already gone by the time we reached the trailhead. Every now and then I think about it. Not the bear, not the moose, not even the burned forest. I think about what that dad must have felt, seeing some stranger charging into his campsite in the middle of the night, waving a knife in his underwear. I think about how that story probably gets told around their dinner table now, about the crazy guy in the woods. And I think about how, somewhere out there, I might be the villain in someone else's campfire story. The thing they joke about, but also maybe half believe. I don't blame them. I probably would have done the same. But next time, I'm bringing bear spray and pants. We used to go camping every fall in southeastern Oklahoma when I was a kid. I don't think we ever missed a year from the time I was about 6 until maybe 12. It was a family tradition. One of those things you just took for granted would always happen. My dad, uncles, grandparents, cousins, everyone would pack up their campers, tents, rifles, and coolers and head out to the same general area of public land. It was remote but not completely cut off. There were rough gravel roads leading in and out, and the campsites weren't really official, just clearings along the treeline that we claimed year after year. We'd usually go during hunting season, so the men would get up early, hunt until midday, and then relax around camp while the kids ran around in the woods, climbed trees, or rode bikes through the dirt trails. At night, everyone gathered around the fire. That was my favorite part, roasting marshmallows, listening to my uncles tell ghost stories, watching the fire crackle and throw shadows into the brush. It was always cold enough to bundle up, but not freezing. My mom and aunts would make big meals over portable stoves, and we'd sleep in pop-up campers or big canvas tents. It always felt safe. Everyone knew each other. It was our thing. No one else camped that deep where we were. We'd sometimes see other trucks drive by during the day, but rarely. This one year, I think I was 11, maybe 12, the weather was colder than usual. We had a big turnout. Probably 25 people all together. My cousins and I were sitting around the fire with our parents and grandparents. It was already dark, maybe 9:30 or 10 at night. Everyone was bundled up in flannel and jackets, passing around hot chocolate and telling stories. The fire was big that night, throwing sparks up into the cold, black sky. Someone had just finished telling a story. I think it was my Uncle Keith, about some haunted trail he made up. Everyone was laughing, and then things just shifted. I heard it before I saw anything. The crunch of tires on gravel. Not close, but not far either. You could tell it was a big vehicle by the weight of the sound. Gravel popping under heavy tires. At first, no one said anything, but the laughter kind of stopped. Heads turned toward the road. Like I said, traffic out there wasn't normal, especially not at night. Most people wouldn't drive into that area after dark unless they really knew it, and even then, they'd probably wait for morning. So it got real quiet for a minute as the sound got louder. The truck pulled up just out of sight, behind the trees that marked the edge of our camp. Then the headlights turned, sweeping through the trees like searchlights, blinding us for a second. It was a big truck, an older model with a lifted body and giant tires. Maybe a Ford or Chevy. I couldn't tell. It was loud, not just the engine, but the sound of the thing settling when it came to a stop. The truck parked across the entrance to our site, sideways across the road, blocking the only easy way in or out. That's when my dad stood up. A couple of my uncles followed. Nobody said anything right away, but I saw them exchanging looks. My dad reached down and picked up his rifle. He didn't point it or anything, just held it like he was ready. The same way he'd hold it walking into the woods at dawn. Then the truck doors opened, one after another. Guys started climbing out, 3 from the cab, and then more from the bed. I counted 9. They were all men, dressed in camo or dark jackets. Some had hats, some had beards, a few looked older, but most seemed to be in their 30s or 40s. They didn't say anything, just stood by their truck, some with rifles or shotguns in hand, watching us. It was completely silent except for the pop and hiss of the campfire and the low rumble of the truck engines still idling. My stomach felt cold, and I remember looking at my mom. She was staring at them, frozen, with her arm across my little sister's shoulders. None of the other kids said a word. My grandpa, who was in his late 60s by then, stood up too, but didn't go far. My dad and one of my uncles, Uncle Gary, I think, started walking slowly toward the truck. Both of them had their rifles in hand, but pointed down. Not aggressive, just cautious. I could barely make out the conversation from where I sat, and even now I can't remember the exact words, just the tone. Calm, serious, but tense. They talked for a few minutes, and then I saw my dad nod once, slowly. The two of them turned and walked back to the fire. The men by the truck just stood there for a moment longer, then got back in their vehicle. The doors slammed shut in quick, heavy thuds. The truck sat there another 10 seconds or so, engine revving, and then it slowly backed up, turned, and drove off into the night, the taillights fading behind the trees. When my dad came back to the fire, everyone was dead silent. Even the fire seemed quieter. He didn't explain anything right away, just told us to get ready for bed, and that we were still leaving in the morning like we'd planned. But later, once most of the younger kids were asleep, I overheard him talking to my mom and my uncle. He said those guys were pissed. They claimed we were taking their deer, told us we didn't belong there, said they'd been hunting in those mountains for years and that it was theirs now. My dad said one of them had looked him in the eye and told him we had until the end of the weekend to pack up and leave, but that it would be better if we were gone before then. They didn't yell. They didn't make a scene. But they made it real clear they were serious. My mom was shaken up. I could tell by the way she kept asking if we were going to be safe. My dad just kept saying we'd be out of there by morning. He and a couple of the men stayed up that night, sat by the fire with their rifles nearby. I don't think they slept at all. I tried to sleep, but every sound outside the tent made my heart jump. I kept thinking the truck was going to come back, that we'd wake up surrounded. Morning came, cold and quiet. We packed everything up fast. No one made breakfast. No one really talked. Everyone just worked. By 9 o'clock, we were pulling out in a line of trucks and campers. My dad's truck was near the back, and I remember watching the woods as we drove out, half expecting to see one of those guys standing in the trees watching us go. We never went back after that year. No one said it out loud at first, but we all knew. The next fall, we picked a different spot, closer to home, more populated. The tradition kind of fizzled out after that. A few of my uncles still hunt, but they go to different places now. The big group trip stopped. The stories around the fire stopped. It didn't scare me that much at the time. I was old enough to know something weird had happened, but not old enough to understand just how dangerous it could have been. Looking back now, knowing what I do about people and guns and rural land disputes, it chills me in a different way. Those guys showed up armed at night to intimidate an entire family. They didn't care that there were kids there. They didn't care that there were 24 of us. They just stood there confident, like they owned the place. It makes me wonder what would have happened if my dad or uncle had said the wrong thing. If someone had reached for their rifle a second too fast. If someone had just taken offense at the tone of a voice. Could have turned into something awful. Could have turned deadly. But it didn't. We left.
We didn't argue.
We didn't try to prove a point. And maybe that's what saved us. I still think about that night sometimes. The way the firelight flickered against those silent men standing in the dark. The quiet tension that hung in the cold air. And how fast something that always felt safe and familiar turned into something that never felt the same again. It was early July when we planned a camping trip out to Wells Gray Provincial Park near Clearwater, British Columbia. We'd been talking about it for months, needing a proper break from work, phones, noise, everything.
It was just me and 2 friends.
We'd rented a small cabin not far from Clearwater Lake, tucked deep enough into the woods that we wouldn't see anyone unless we wanted to. No cell service, just nature. The kind of quiet where the loudest sound was your boots on gravel or the crackle of the fire at night. Perfect, we thought. We got there late in the afternoon on a Friday. The cabin was simple, a single room with bunks, a wood stove, and a few shelves for food. No electricity, no running water. Just an outhouse about 20 feet into the trees. We spent that evening gathering firewood, setting up the lanterns, unpacking gear. The sun set slow and deep orange, and the whole forest fell quiet except for the occasional distant owl or the rustling of something small moving through underbrush. There was always something moving, but it never felt threatening. Just the usual wilderness stuff. That first night, we made dinner over the fire, canned chili, some sausages, a few beers to wash it all down. We sat up late just watching the flames. It's amazing how long you can sit around a fire without talking, just listening and thinking. Around midnight, the air turned cold, even for summer, so we finally crawled into our sleeping bags in the cabin. I remember falling asleep to the sound of wind brushing through the tall pines outside. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up to lights flashing through the cracks in the cabin walls. Not firelight, flashlights, headlamps, white and sharp, moving. I sat up slowly, confused, my mind still stuck halfway in a dream. Then I heard boots, heavy boots, more than one pair, crunching gravel outside. The front door creaked, then a knock, firm, repeated. I looked at my friends. One of them was already sitting up, the other was still trying to wake up. We opened the door and were hit with beams of light. I squinted. There were at least 3 men standing there.
Arsenic.
Uniforms. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. The others had sidearms. Behind them, a police truck idled quietly with its lights spinning, and a second vehicle was parked not far off with 2 German shepherds pacing and barking inside. They told us to come outside. No real explanations yet. Just orders. Come out of the cabin, slowly, all 3 of you. We stepped out into the cold, early morning air.
It was still dark.
Not even a hint of sun. The smell of pine and cold earth hit me. The gravel felt like ice under my socks. They lined us up along the side of the cabin. One of the officers stood facing us while the other 2 moved toward the vehicles. That's when I saw the dogs again, now out and straining against their leashes, already barking. Then one of the cops said something that locked everything in place. There's been an escape. Local holding facility. Inmate missing. Dogs picked up a trail heading this way. That's all he said, but it was enough. My mouth felt dry. My stomach sank. We were just out here trying to disconnect, and now we were in the middle of some manhunt. The dogs came forward, handlers keeping them close. They sniffed the ground hard, circled, barked again, then moved toward us. One of the officers brought over a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a ragged piece of fabric. Looked like a shirt or jacket. Dark blue.
Dirty.
They held it out for the dogs. One of the dogs lunged at it, pulling hard on the leash, whining like it wanted to go. The next few minutes were a blur. The dogs were walked up to us, one by one. They sniffed each of us, shoes, pant legs, backpacks that had been tossed outside. They moved fast, trained, methodical. You could tell they'd done this before. One of the dogs barked sharply and turned toward the woods behind the cabin. The handler pointed, and the other officer nodded. We were told to grab our gear and prepare to evacuate. It wasn't a request. They said it fast, like they'd said it 100 times before. Grab essentials. Leave food if you have to. We're escorting you out. No one argued. We shoved everything back into our bags as fast as we could. I left my toothbrush behind.
Didn't even think about it.
We just wanted to get out. There was this pressure in the air now, like the forest was holding its breath. Like we weren't supposed to be here anymore. The police drove us out in a convoy. It was still dark. The headlights lit up nothing but trees and fog as we bumped down that narrow gravel road for what felt like forever. I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see someone running after us in the shadows. Nothing ever came, but my nerves didn't settle. When we got to the main road, they let us out at a gas station. There were already other campers and hikers being dropped off there too. Everyone looked the same, tired, confused, tense. Some had come from further up the park, others from lakeside spots. It wasn't just our cabin. They were clearing out a huge area. We stood there in the early light, watching the fog lift off the highway. There was a kind of heaviness in the silence between people.
Like no one really knew what to say.
Eventually, we got in the car and started the long drive back to Kamloops. No music, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional radio update. By late afternoon, we got word through the news. The man had been caught. The dogs found him not far from where we'd been staying, less than a kilometer downhill from the cabin. He'd apparently tried to sleep under some rocks, half covered in moss and branches. He must have been freezing. No gear, just a torn-up uniform and shoes that looked too small for him. When they found him, he tried to run, but didn't get far. The dogs caught up quick. They didn't release many details, but one of the articles said something about minor injuries during apprehension. We all knew what that meant. The dogs got to him before the officers did. I didn't feel bad. That night, back home, I kept thinking about how close he'd been. We'd been sitting by the fire, laughing and drinking, completely unaware. He might have even watched us. He might have passed through camp while we were sleeping. Could have been just feet away. We canceled the rest of the trip. Didn't even think about going back. The thought of being out in the woods, isolated, knowing that someone desperate and dangerous could just appear out of nowhere. No thanks. It wasn't the wilderness I was scared of. Not bears or storms or getting lost. It was people. People hiding where they don't belong. We all slept with our phones beside our pillows for a few weeks after that. I locked my doors twice every night, sometimes 3 times, even though we lived in a quiet neighborhood. Something about that trip stuck. The randomness of it, the closeness of it. How things can go from peaceful to dangerous in an instant, with no warning. I still go camping sometimes, but never without checking local alerts. Never without service or a satellite phone. And never, ever near any place with a jail.